Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Buckle up, because today we are not waiting in the shallow end. We are diving straight into, well, the single most contentious, heated, and profound debate in human history.
It's putting it lightly.
We are talking about the existence of God, the origins of religious belief, and the clash, the absolute collision between faith and science. And I have to warn you, the source material we have today, it pulls no punches. It calls religious belief a delusion, compares God to a childhood imaginary friend, and dissects the biology of our bodies to argue against a creator. It is provocative, it is aggressive, and it really forces you to question the very foundations of why we believe what we believe.
It is definitely not a deep dive for the faint of heart. We are analyzing a transcript involving some very prominent, very articulate critics of religion think along the lines of the new atheist movement.
Right.
And what makes it so fascinating is the breadth of their attack. They don't just stick to philosophy, they go through psychology, history, evolutionary biology, and even astrophysics to build a case that God is a man-made fiction.
Exactly. So our mission today is just to unpack the logic behind these arguments.
Oh.
We aren't here to take sides. We are here to act as your guides through this intense landscape and explain the reasoning provided in this source.
A lot to get through.
It is. So before we jump into the heavy stuff, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. It really helps us keep these deep dives coming.
So if we look at the roadmap for today, we're going to break this down into three main layers. First, we'll look at the human mind, the psychology and geography of why we believe.
Okay.
Then we'll move to the universe and the biological evidence regarding design. And finally, we will end on the philosophical argument for why skepticism might actually be more virtuous than faith.
Let's jump right into the psychology of it then. The source starts with a really striking image. The speaker asks the audience to raise their hands if they believe in God, sees a forest of hands, and then
Immediately labels the entire room deluded.
Deluded, yeah.
Right. It sets the tone immediately. The source equates belief in God to a child having an imaginary friend.
That's a powerful comparison.
It is. If you see a child talking to an invisible friend who comforts them, you think it's cute. But the argument here is that religion is essentially adults refusing to let go of that imaginary friend.
So God comforts you, consoles you.
Acts as a companion, but just like the child's friend, there is, zero evidence this being actually exists outside your head.
And using that word delusion, it feels so heavy, right? It sounds like a medical diagnosis.
It does. But the source argues that mass delusion is actually the norm in human history, not the exception.
What do they mean by that?
Precisely. The source makes the point that universality is not an argument for truth. Just because billions of people believe something doesn't make it real.
Okay.
There was a time when every single human being on Earth believed the world was flat. There was a time when everyone believed the sun revolved around the Earth.
Right. Those were delusions held by the entire species.
Exactly. And the source argues that religious belief is just the latest version of that, a comforting story we all agreed to tell ourselves.
And then the source pivots to this idea of the geography of faith, which I found to be one of the most compelling arguments because it's just statistical fact.
The accident of birth argument.
Yes. The idea that what you believe is largely an accident of where your mother happened to be when you were born.
It's a tough one to argue with. The source points out that if you were born in Arkansas, you are overwhelmingly likely to be a Christian. If you were born in Kabul,
You're Muslim.
you're a Muslim. If you were born in Viking-era Scandinavia,
Yeah.
you'd be praying to Thor.
Right. You wouldn't be sitting there thinking, I wonder if Islam is the true path. You would be worrying about ice giants.
Exactly. And the source argues that people in all these places feel equally fervent. They all think they have the absolute truth. But logically,
They can't all be right.
they can't. Since these religions make mutually exclusive claims, different gods, different rules, different afterlives, the source suggests that since your specific god depends on the GPS coordinates of the hospital you were born in, it's highly probable that none of them are right.
So if these beliefs are geographically accidental and scientifically unsupported, why do we hold on to them so tightly? The source brings up some heavy hitters here, Freud and Nietzsche, to explain the why.
Yes. You have Nietzsche, who famously said God is dead. But the source leaves really heavily on Sigmund Freud, suggesting that for most people, the psychological root of religion is God is dad.
God is that. Okay, let's unpack this. This is the wish fulfillment theory, right?
It is. The source argues that God is a man-made invention born out of fear. Think about it. As children, the world is scary, but we have a father figure to protect us.
Sure.
As adults, we realize the universe is even scarier. It's indifferent, and eventually, we die. Our biological parents can't save us from that.
So we invent a super dad.
Exactly. We project a father figure onto the sky, a parent who is all-powerful, who will never desert us, who loves us more than we deserve, and crucially, who creates a safety net after death.
That's what they mean by wish fulfillment.
We believe it not because it's true, but because we desperately want it to be true.
But there is a darker side to this God is dad concept mentioned in the source. It's not just about comfort, it's about authority. The source calls it a desire for a celestial dictatorship.
That is a very strong phrase, celestial dictatorship.
It is.
The source argues that there is an underdeveloped part of the human psyche that, well, it craves totalitarianism. It wants a boss. It wants to be told what to do.
And that's dangerous.
The speaker warns that this desire to worship, to submit to a celestial dictator who watches your every move and even your thoughts, is very dangerous.
Because it prepares you for earthly dictators.
Exactly. If you are willing to surrender your critical thinking and autonomy to a sky god, the source argues you are much more likely to surrender it to a political tyrant. It describes this as a threat to secular civilization, because it values submission over freedom.
So we have established the source's view on why we believe it's comfort, geography, a desire for authority. Now let's look at the gods themselves. The source lays out this evolutionary timeline of religion that suggests we are slowly getting rid of them.
It is a witty take on religious history, yeah.
Yeah.
The source traces the timeline. First, you have animism. Spirits are everywhere. They are in the trees, the springs, the rocks.
River spirit is angry, that sort of thing.
Right. If the river floods, it's angry. Then you consolidate. You get polytheism.
A committee of gods on Mount
A
Olympus.
committee, a bureaucracy. You have a god for war, a god for the sun, a god for wine. But as we learned how the sun actually works, that it's a ball of hydrogen, not a chariot, we fired the sun god.
And then you have monotheism. You get it down to just one god, which the source sarcastically calls progress.
Because they are getting closer to the true figure, which the source implies is zero. The logic is, we are all atheists about most of the gods that humanity has ever believed in. Some of us just go one god further.
But this leads to the biggest counter-argument from believers, which the source tackles head-on. Why is there something rather than nothing?
The ultimate question.
Even if you get rid of Zeus and Thor, you still have a universe. You still have complex life. You have the human eye.
And this is where the source says Charles Darwin changed the game completely. Before Darwin, if you looked at a bird or a tree or the human eye, the complexity was just overwhelming. It looks designed.
It was the best argument for God.
It was the best argument. The only logical answer seemed to be a designer. But the source says Darwin blew that out of the water.
Completely.
Completely.
Right.
Evolution by natural selection explains how you get from simple cells to complex humans without a designer. It explains the complexity through a slow, grinding process of death and survival.
Yeah.
So the source argues that theists have been forced to retreat.
They can't use the design of life argument anymore.
Not effectively.
Mm.
So they retreat to the very beginning, the Big Bang. They retreat to the question, okay, but who started the Big Bang? Who lit the fuse?
Right.
But the source argues that the origin of the cosmos was likely a very simple event, unlike the complexity of life. And, more importantly, the source brings up the problem of infinite regress.
This is the who made God argument.
Exactly. If you say the universe is complex, so it must have a creator, you haven't actually solved the problem. You've just pushed it back one step.
Right.
Because now you have to explain the creator. If the creator is complex enough to make a universe, who made the creator? And who made that creator?
And if the believer says, oh, God doesn't need a creator, then the atheist asks,
Then why does the universe need one? Precisely. The source argues that if you invoke God to explain existence, you have explained absolutely nothing. You are just using a word to stop thinking.
Now, speaking of the universe, the source paints a picture of reality that is, well, very different from the religious view. The religious view is usually that the universe is a garden made for us, but the source describes it as violent.
It really challenges the fine-tuning argument. The source points out that the universe is not a garden. It is a place of massive, constant destruction. Every single second since the Big Bang, star suns larger than our own are blowing up, collapsing into black holes or burning out.
It's constant annihilation.
It is. It's wasteful on a massive scale. If this was designed for humans, it is an incredibly inefficient design. Most of the universe is empty vacuum, lethal radiation, and freezing cold.
And here is where it gets really interesting. The source finds something beautiful in that destruction. It talks about stardust.
Yes. This is where science offers its own version of majesty. The source explains that we are physically made of the materials cooked up in those exploding stars.
So the carbon, the iron.
The carbon in your cells, the iron in your blood, the oxygen you breathe, none of that existed at the beginning. It was forged in the nuclear furnaces of stars that then exploded.
So we are literally nuclear waste from dead stars.
In the most poetic sense, yes. The source argues that this scientific reality, that we are stardust, is far more majestic, beautiful, and impressive than the biblical story of a burning bush.
Because it's verifiable.
Exactly. It connects us to the cosmos physically, and it is verifiable.
There is another historical fact the source brings up to challenge the religious narrative of special creation, and this one really made me stop and think. It's about the other humanoids.
This is a point often overlooked.
Yeah.
We tend to think history is just animals and then us.
Right.
But the source mentions that until quite recently, about 50,000 years ago, we weren't the only humans. There were at least 4 other kinds of bipedal humanoids on Earth: Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis.
And they all died out. We are just the survivors.
Right. And the source asks the theological question: did they have gods? Did they have souls? Did Jesus die for the Neanderthals?
Wow.
Religion usually ignores their existence entirely because it complicates the narrative that we are the chosen center of creation. The reality is, we're just the surviving twig on a much larger family tree.
Speaking of family trees, let's get to what the source claims is the single most convincing fact against creationism. It's not fossils, it's DNA.
This is a devastating argument if you follow the logic. The source explains that with modern DNA sequencing, we can look at the letter-to-letter correspondences in genes between any 2 animals.
Human and chimp, mouse and rat.
Right, and the genetic resemblances fall into a perfect hierarchy, a perfect family tree.
And this includes vestigial genes, right? The broken code that doesn't do anything anymore.
Exactly. Think of it like plagiarism errors. We carry the scars of our evolution in our DNA. We have genes that are broken, like the gene to make vitamin C, that are broken in the exact same way in chimpanzees.
So if a designer built us separately, why would he paste the same broken code into both of us?
Exactly. The source argues that the only alternative to evolution is that an intelligent designer deliberately arranged our DNA, including the broken bits, to look exactly like a family tree, just to deceive us.
So either evolution is true, or God is a trickster who is planting evidence to test our faith.
That is the deceptive designer argument. And the source finds that idea not only absurd, but morally repulsive. Why would a God of truth lie to us through our own biology?
You would think that this kind of evidence, DNA, stardust, other humanoids, would be enough to shift the debate. But the source tells a story about a geologist named Kurt Wise that illustrates why evidence often doesn't matter to the fundamentalist mindset.
Ah, yes, the segment on willful ignorance. Kurt Wise is not uneducated. He has a PhD in geology from Harvard. He knows the science. He has seen the data.
He knows better.
He knows better. But he famously stated that even if all the evidence in the universe, all the rocks, all the stars, all the math pointed to an old Earth, he would still be a young Earth creationist.
Why?
Because that is what Holy Scripture teaches.
That is, wow. I mean, that is explicitly admitting that reality is irrelevant if it contradicts the book.
The source calls this mindset a disgrace to the human species.
That is harsh.
It is harsh, but you have to understand the source's perspective. To them, the unique power of the human mind is the ability to reason, to discover truth, to figure out how the world works.
And to throw that away.
To look at verifiable reality and say, I don't care, I'm sticking to the dogma, is to throw away your humanity. The source describes it as sticking your fingers in your ears and saying, la, la, la.
This brings us to the philosophical core of the deep dive. The source contrasts this faith mindset with the scientific mindset, using Socrates as the model.
Socrates is famous for saying, the only thing I know is that I know nothing. The source argues that you are only truly educated when you understand the extent of your own ignorance.
And science embodies that, doesn't it? Science is about admitting you're wrong. The germ theory replaced curses and demons. We learned we were wrong about disease, and that saved billions of lives.
Exactly. Science is about doubt. It's about inquiry. It's about admitting you don't know and then trying to find out. The source argues that faith, by contrast, is often treated as a virtue, but it's actually an intellectual vice.
A vice.
Yes, because faith asserts, I know the answer, without evidence. It shuts down inquiry. The source asks, Where is the usefulness of faith?
I see.
In a real crisis, in a pandemic, in an earthquake, faith doesn't solve the problem. Inquiry, debate, and doubt solve the problem. The source argues that we should value skepticism over blind belief.
And this leads to the final and perhaps most political warning in the source. We talked about the celestial dictatorship earlier. The source argues that religion is not just a private hobby, it claims to be a total solution.
This is crucial. We often hear religion is a private matter. The source flatly disagrees. It argues that because religion claims to have the ultimate answer, salvation, often on pain of eternal punishment, it cannot be private.
It demands total submission.
It demands total submission. The source calls it totalitarian. It claims to solve all problems, not through evidence, but through dogma. And for the critics in our source, that claim to absolute authority is a direct threat to a free, open, secular civilization.
Because if you believe, you have a direct line to the creator.
You don't need democracy,
Yeah.
and that is dangerous.
So what does this all mean? We have traveled a long way in this deep dive. We've moved from the psychological need for a sky father to protect us,
Through the wasteful but majestic universe of exploding stars.
down to the microscopic evidence of DNA, and finally to this clash between the virtue of doubt and the disgrace of willful ignorance.
It is a comprehensive dismantling of the religious worldview. The source challenges us to look at the universe as it really is, violent, complex, and indifferent, rather than how we wish it to be.
Correct.
It suggests that the delusion of religion, while comforting, actually blocks us from seeing the true majesty of reality.
It really forces you to ask, is belief a bridge to understanding, or is it a barrier? The source is pretty clear on its answer, but it leaves the listener with a heavy burden, the burden of facing the universe without a safety net.
And that leads to a final thought derived from the source's logic. We often look for miracles, water into wine, parting seas. But the source points out that we are made of the debris of dead stars, organized by billions of years of trial and error into beings that can think, speak, and understand their own origins.
So the question is, if the universe is vast, violent, and indifferent, does the majesty of reality actually require a creator to be beautiful? Or is the fact that we are here at all conscious matter, waking up to witness the universe miracle enough?
That is the question.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Keep questioning.